This is a Sutotal production. Hello, surveyors. Sutotal here, looking at functional groups for Chapter 9. All right, so this is going to be our last practice set for Chapter 9. And so really just want to make sure that you are comfortable and you're good with identifying different functional groups. So, what do we have here? All right, so one thing I want to point out here in looking at this first set here, these are our options in terms of functional groups. Now, sometimes you can have multiple functional groups in one structure, all right? And this first one is an example of that. This is actually two separate functional groups. All right, so I want you to notice the placement of this double bonded oxygen, the carbon, and then how this oxygen is not bound to this carbon, okay? Because this oxygen is not bound to this carbon, this guy and this guy are two separate functional groups. So this is what we would call a ketone, right? Because the carbonyl carbon here, this guy right here, it has two carbons attached to it, okay? And then this one is an ether, okay? You're going to confuse. I can go ahead and tell you right now, because it happens 90% of the time, you're going to confuse, in the beginning at least, ethers and esters. All right, so this is an ether. We have a carbon that's bound to two different, an oxygen that's bound to two different carbons, and neither of these carbons has a carbonyl, has a double bonded oxygen on it. Now, where is the real kicker? Right here. Where is an ester? This right here is the ester functional group. You notice you have the carbonyl carbon, right? So it's got the double bond oxygen, and then it has the single bonded oxygen. Do not consider this two separate functional groups. This is one. It's the ester, okay? Notice the difference in the ester and the ether. Notice the difference in the ester from a combination of ketone and ether, all right? The connection is very important there. All right, next up, we have a double bonded oxygen, and that double bonded oxygen, the carbon also has an OH on it. So this is not a ketone. This is what we call a carboxylic acid. Okay, so when you see the double bonded O and the OH, that's carboxylic acid. Okay, so just because it has an OH doesn't make it a carboxylic acid. Like for instance right here, we went and looked at that naming. Right, this OH is bound to a carbon that does not have a double bonded oxygen. So this is not a carboxylic acid. This is an alcohol functional group. Okay. Now this also has two other functional groups. It has a carbon-carbon triple bond, which we know as an alkyne, and then it also has a carbon-carbon double bond, which we know as an alkene. All right. Next up, we see a double bonded oxygen with a carbon, but it's got one carbon connection and then the hydrogen. So when you have this carbonyl, this double bonded oxygen at the end of a chain or something, this is not a ketone. This is an aldehyde. Okay, that H, right? Seeing it on this carbon with the carbonyl, right? That is the carbonyl carbon, right? That H tells you it's an aldehyde. And then over here, we have an amine functional group. A-M-I-N-E. Okay, an amine. Okay, now you're going to confuse amines with amides. And I gave you an amide. Here we have an amide right here. Okay, you notice, you don't just have a nitrogen bound to carbon, right? One of those carbons that this nitrogen is bound to is a double bonded oxygen. Okay, here, the carbon that's bound to does not have a double bonded oxygen, right? So it's an amine, while this is an amide, right? Amine, amide. You're going to confuse those two. Be wary. Beware. Okay. All right, so next up, we'll go to this one now. Here we have just the double bonded oxygen. So this is another ketone. Okay. And then here we have a carbon-carbon double bond. So this is an alkene, just like we saw up here in this guy. All right. So one of my main goals here was to, I know it's a short video, but I really wanted to kind of focus in on the difference between amines and amides so you don't confuse them. focusing on the difference between ketones and aldehydes, but also focusing on the difference between esters and ethers. Those are the 3 sets of functional groups that students mix up in their head. So don't take identifying functional groups lightly. The slightest difference in connection changes everything. All right. Anyway, so that does it. Adios. Stay weird.